James Carter, a self-made millionaire, possesses everything others dream of: wealth, power, and a beautiful wife. But behind the gates of his luxurious mansion lies a dark secret that could destroy it all. When a homeless boy accidentally overhears a murder plot, the truth begins to unravel. The very people James trusts the most are secretly planning to eliminate him to seize his fortune. Can James expose the conspiracy before it's too late? And what role will the homeless boy, a complete stranger, play in saving his life? Behind betrayal lies unexpected loyalty. Behind pain lies the hope for rebirth. Step into this gripping journey and uncover the truth. The antique clock hanging on the living room wall ticked steadily, its sound echoing through the quiet expanse of James Carter's opulent mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. Everything in James's home exuded wealth and perfection, from the high ceilings adorned with shimmering crystal chandeliers to the ornate art pieces hung on polished mahogany walls. It was the product of over 15 years of relentless hard work by James, a self-made millionaire in the technology and real estate industries. But for James, this perfection was becoming increasingly unfamiliar. He sat alone in his study, staring at his computer screen filled with graphs and figures related to his company. On the desk sat a framed photo of him and Sophia, his beautiful, elegant wife. Sophia embodied grace itself: flowing chestnut hair, eyes as blue as a springtime lake, and a sweet smile that once melted his heart. Yet, lately, Sophia was no longer the woman he used to know. Leaning back in his chair, James rubbed his temples in exhaustion. His mind swirled with unspoken concerns. Sophia had been frequently absent from home, claiming she was busy with charity work and social events. Though she always appeared attentive when she was with him, her gaze seemed increasingly distant and cold. Downstairs, Sophia was on the phone in the living room. Her voice was soft but carried an edge, revealing her dissatisfaction. "Father, I've told you. We need to wait a bit longer," she said, her eyes darting to the large glass doors that looked out onto the garden. "He hasn't suspected anything yet. But we need to be careful. If we rush, everything could fall apart." On the other end of the line, Richard Prescott, Sophia's father, responded impatiently. "You've dragged this out long enough, Sophia. Time isn't on our side. His company is growing stronger every day, and with each passing moment, your share of his wealth dwindles. We need to act before he figures out what's going on." Sophia sighed, forcing her tone to remain calm. "I know, but trust me. I've got everything under control." She hung up, her eyes gazing into the distance. A part of her hesitated, but the thought of James's massive fortune quickly erased any lingering guilt. Sophia knew she no longer loved James. If love had ever existed, it had long since been replaced by greed and a longing for independence. That night, as James walked down from his study to the dining room, Sophia was already seated, holding a glass of red wine. She looked up and offered him a gentle smile. "Finished with work? I made reservations for us tonight at La Belle. It's been so long since we've spent time together," she said. James stopped in his tracks, raising his eyebrows slightly in surprise. Sophia rarely took the initiative to plan evenings together, but he quickly brushed off the odd feeling, telling himself that perhaps she was trying to improve their relationship. "Thank you, Sophia. I'll be ready in 15 minutes, he replied, forcing a smile in return. During dinner at La Belle, Sophia skillfully steered the conversation toward casual, everyday topics, but James couldn't shake the sense that something was off. She appeared cheerful but asked him unusually specific questions about his schedule for the next day. "Do you have any important meetings tomorrow morning?" Sophia asked, pouring more wine into James's glass. "Yes, I need to drive to the main office in New York for a board meeting." "Why do you ask?" "No reason. I just want to make sure you're not overworking yourself." "You've been so busy lately," she said with a soft tone. James took a sip of his wine, studying her carefully. "You've been unusually attentive to me lately. Is there something going on, Sophia?" Sophia laughed, shaking her head lightly. "You're always suspicious of everything. I just want to take care of you, that's all." But even as she laughed, her eyes betrayed no real emotion. A chill ran down James's spine. Back home later that night, James went to bed but couldn't sleep. He lay staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with tangled thoughts. Was he imagining things, or was Sophia truly hiding something? Across the mansion, Sophia sat in her private study, holding a half-finished glass of wine. Her phone lit up with a message from her father, Richard Prescott. "Everything is ready. Tomorrow morning it all begins." Sophia turned off her phone, a cryptic smile forming on her lips. The dim streetlights cast a faint glow over a dark corner of an abandoned parking lot, where distant car horns served as a reminder that New York City never sleeps. Ethan, a 15-year-old boy with a dirt-streaked face and worn-out clothes, sat huddled under a piece of cardboard, trying to fend off the biting cold of a December night. It had been 3 years since Ethan lost his family in a tragic car accident. With no relatives to rely on, he had been surviving on the unforgiving streets of the city. But life on the streets had forged him into a sharp and observant boy, a skill that had helped him navigate countless dangers. Ethan had just laid down on his tattered old blanket when a voice from another part of the parking lot startled him. "They won't suspect a thing," a woman's voice said, soft yet razor-sharp. He froze, holding his breath, then quietly crawled toward the sound. Peering through the gap between two rusty cars, Ethan saw two figures: a well-dressed woman, Sophia, and an older man with an authoritative presence, Richard Prescott. They stood next to a sleek black SUV, their faces serious and their eyes coldly calculating. "Have his car's brakes been taken care of?" Sophia asked, her voice low but clear in the stillness of the night. "Don't worry," Richard replied, his expression icy. "Everything's set. Tomorrow morning when he leaves the house, no one will suspect a thing. It'll look like an accident." Sophia let out a quiet laugh, but it was chilling in its malice. "Finally, everything will be ours. His company, his fortune, everything." Ethan felt paralyzed on the spot. He couldn't believe his ears. These two people who looked so wealthy and powerful were casually discussing a murder plot. And their target, a man named James, seemed to have no idea about the danger looming over him. Ethan wanted to run, to forget what he had just overheard, but his conscience wouldn't let him. "I have to do something," he whispered to himself, his heart pounding in his chest. The next morning, weak sunlight spilled over James Carter's mansion. The tall, wrought iron gates curved elegantly, opening onto a stone-paved driveway that led to the garage, where his sleek silver sports car was parked. James stepped out of the house, one hand adjusting his tie, the other holding a briefcase. He was just about to get into his car when he noticed a boy standing a few yards away from the gate. The boy looked disheveled, his clothes torn and dirty, his face both desperate and urgent. "What are you doing here?" James asked loudly, frowning slightly. Ethan didn't reply right away. He took a deep breath, summoned all his courage, and ran up to James, frantically waving his hands. "You can't go. Don't get in the car." James took a step back, startled by the boy's panic. "What are you talking about? Why can't I go?" Ethan, though terrified, tried to speak as quickly and clearly as possible. "You don't understand. I heard them last night. They want to kill you. The brakes have been cut." James stared at him, half angry, half confused. "They? Who is they? And why should I believe a homeless kid I don't even know?" "Please, you have to believe me," Ethan pleaded, his eyes welling with tears. "I don't know you, but I heard them clearly. Your wife and an older man, they were talking about how you were going to die this morning. You have to check your brakes. If I'm wrong, I'll take all the blame. But if I'm right, your life is in danger." James stood silently for a few seconds, thinking. Everything the boy said sounded absurd, but the desperate look in his eyes and the urgency in his voice were impossible to ignore. He decided to call a mechanic immediately to inspect the car. Half an hour later, the mechanic stepped out of the garage with a heavy expression. "Mr. Carter, I think you'd better sit down for this," he said gravely. "The brakes were deliberately cut. If you had driven at high speed, they would have completely failed." James felt his head spin. The homeless boy's warning was true. Someone, or more specifically, someone close to him, was plotting to kill him. He turned to Ethan, who was standing quietly in the corner of the driveway. "Why did you do this?" James asked, his voice low and full of emotion. Ethan looked up, his eyes shining with resolve. "Because it's the right thing to do. I couldn't let them do it. You don't deserve this." James studied the boy for a long moment before nodding. "All right, you've saved my life, and now I need you to help me save the rest of it." James led Ethan into the mansion, where the boy found himself stepping into a space so vast and dazzling it left him awestruck. The white walls gleamed, the polished hardwood floors shone, and the light from a massive crystal chandelier reflected across the room, making Ethan feel as though he had entered an entirely different world. James pointed to the large sofa in the living room and said, "Have a seat. Tell me everything you heard in detail." Ethan sat down, still feeling awkward in such a luxurious space. I was looking for shelter last night in an abandoned parking lot in the city. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I overheard a woman and an older man. They were talking about how they had cut the brakes on your car. The woman called you her husband, so I figured she must be your wife." James remained silent, his face hardening as he listened to Ethan's account. He began connecting the dots: Sophia's frequent absences, his father-in-law Richard's constant meddling in his financial decisions, and how Sophia had recently encouraged him to increase his life insurance coverage. Ethan continued, his voice trembling slightly as he feared James wouldn't believe him. "They said that this morning, when you drove to your meeting, no one would suspect it was anything other than an accident. I know I'm just a street kid, but I couldn't ignore what I heard." James could feel the sincerity in the boy's voice. Leaning back in his chair, he clasped his hands together, his head bowed. The weight of betrayal from those closest to him bore down on him. Yet he knew he had to stay calm. Acting impulsively would neither save his life nor stop Sophia and Richard's plan. He looked up at Ethan, his eyes filled with determination. "Thank you for telling me this. I believe you. And now I need your help to gather more evidence." "Evidence?" Ethan asked, surprised. "That's right," James replied, his voice low but resolute. "If what you're saying is true, I can't just confront them with words. I need concrete proof, something undeniable. And I think you can help me get it." Ethan was silent for a moment, then nodded. "I'll do whatever I can to help you." James stood, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "From now on, we work together. You saved my life, Ethan. Now, together, we're going to save everything else." A homeless boy with extraordinary courage has spoken up to stop a dark conspiracy. But will Ethan's warning be enough to convince James? And will the truth come to light before it's too late? Don't miss the tense developments in the next chapter. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to continue supporting this story. James sat in his office, his eyes fixed on the computer screen, but his mind was entirely consumed by Ethan's words. The feeling of betrayal by Sophia and Richard made his chest tighten. They weren't just family, they were the people he had trusted most. But now, that trust had completely shattered. Across the room, Ethan sat quietly in a large leather chair. The boy looked around, his eyes filled with curiosity but still carrying a hint of caution. It was his first time in such a luxurious space, yet instead of admiration, he felt overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. James broke the silence, turning to face the boy. "I need you to recount everything you heard in as much detail as possible. Don't leave anything out." Ethan nodded and straightened up. They were talking about the brakes. "The man Richard said the brakes had been cut and that this morning you would have an accident. The woman, who I assume is your wife, said everything would belong to her afterward." They laughed, like they were absolutely certain the plan would succeed. James clenched his fists, anger rising inside him, but he quickly composed himself. "Do you remember exactly what they said?" Ethan paused, thinking for a moment, then nodded. "They mentioned your company. They said it would belong to them. And your life insurance. They talked about a large payout that would happen if you died." James took a deep breath, feeling as though he had been stabbed in the chest. Sophia had urged him to double his life insurance policy a few months ago, saying it was for the family's safety now. Everything made sense. "All right," James said, his voice steady but contemplative. "We need evidence. What you've told me is critical, but without something concrete, they'll deny everything. I need to confirm this before making any moves." Ethan lifted his head, his eyes filled with determination. "What do you want me to do?" James looked at the boy, a sense of respect welling up inside him. Ethan was young, but he had shown a kind of bravery not everyone possessed. James decided to share part of his plan. "Can you keep watching them?" James asked. "If Richard and Sophia are really plotting this, they'll keep talking about it. You know how to stay silent and keep yourself hidden, don't you?" Ethan nodded firmly. "I've lived on the streets long enough to know how to stay out of sight. They won't know I'm watching them." James offered a faint smile, feeling a glimmer of hope in the midst of his dire situation for the first time. "Good. But you need to be careful. If they realize you're onto them, I don't know what they'll do." Ethan swallowed hard but didn't waver. "I understand, but I can do this." Sophia sat in the grand living room of her parents' house, a glass of red wine shimmering in her hand. Across from her, Richard lounged in his chair, his expression calm but his eyes calculating. "How did it go this morning?" Richard asked, his tone measured. Sophia took a sip of her wine and shrugged. He didn't drive the car. I don't know why, but I made sure to act as normal as possible. He doesn't suspect anything. Richard nodded, though a hint of frustration flickered across his face. We can't drag this out, Sophia. If he figures anything out, it'll all collapse. That company is our main goal, and I don't want any mistakes. Sophia looked at her father, her eyes flashing with irritation. I know, but we need to be careful. James isn't stupid. If he starts to suspect something, he'll investigate, and then we'll be in trouble. Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression softening slightly. Fine. But we have to act soon. Are you ready for the next step? Sophia was silent for a moment, then nodded. I'm tired of living in his shadow. I'll do whatever it takes to take back what's mine. Richard smiled, satisfied. Good. Make sure no one finds out about this. James sat in his office, his phone pressed to his ear. On the other end was Mark Reynolds, his personal attorney. Mark had worked with James for over a decade, and James trusted him implicitly. Mark, I need you to help me change my will immediately, James said, his voice firm and resolute. Change it? What do you mean? Mark asked, surprised. James closed his eyes, trying to remain calm. I want to add a clause. In the event of my death due to an accident or any suspicious circumstances, all my assets will go to charity instead of Sophia or her family. There was a brief silence on the other end before Mark spoke again. James, what's going on? You're talking like your life is in danger. James took a deep breath, his voice lowering. I can't go into detail right now, Mark, but trust me, this is necessary. All right, Mark replied, his tone serious. I'll start drafting the documents immediately. James set the phone down, his gaze drifting out the window. He knew he had to be more careful than ever. One small mistake could cost him his life. But now, with Ethan and Mark on his side, he felt he had a fighting chance to turn the tables. He turned back toward Ethan, who was sitting on the sofa and watching him with curious eyes. Ethan, James said, breaking the silence, you saved my life this morning. And now, together, we're going to save my company and everything else. From this moment forward, I don't just see you as an ally, I see you as family. Ethan looked at James, a warm feeling spreading through his chest. Thank you, James. I'll do whatever it takes to help you. James smiled. Good. Then let's get started. Ethan stood outside the gates of Richard Prescott's mansion, his eyes scanning every movement around him. The darkness of the winter night provided perfect cover as he hid among the nearby bushes. James had entrusted him with the most critical mission, gathering evidence against Richard and Sophia. With the sharp instincts honed from years of living on the streets, Ethan knew he would have to be extremely cautious. In the pocket of his jacket was a small recording device James had handed him. Make sure you keep a safe distance, James had warned before Ethan left his mansion. They're dangerous. If you think they've spotted you, get out immediately. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling the tension in the air. He wasn't afraid of the task itself. He had followed people before, but the thought of being caught sent a chill through him. His life could be at risk. Still, no matter what, he had promised James he would help him at all costs. Inside the spacious study, Richard Prescott sat across from his daughter, Sophia. A glass of whiskey clinked softly in his hand as he stirred it slowly, his cold eyes fixed on her. We need to bring this to an end soon, Richard said, his voice low and firm. Sophia crossed her arms, her expression irritated. I know. But James isn't the kind of man who's easy to fool. He didn't even use the card this morning. I don't understand why. Richard squinted, a smirk of disdain flickering across his face. Maybe he's starting to suspect something. Are you absolutely sure no one knows about this? Sophia scoffed, her voice confident. No one knows. We've been extremely careful. Richard shook his head and leaned back in his chair. No plan is ever perfect. If he figures something out, you know how he'll react. James isn't the type to back down easily. If he does find out, he could drag us straight to hell with him. Sophia looked at her father, a flicker of unease in her eyes. So what do we do next? Richard set his glass down, clasping his hands together. We need to speed things up. We can't rely on the car accident anymore. You'll need to find a way to get close to him, make him trust you again. Meanwhile, I'll start preparing the next step. Sophia sat up straight and nodded. I'll do my part. Ethan stayed hidden in the shadows, listening to the entire conversation through the slight opening in the study's window. He pressed the recorder tightly to his ear, double-checking to ensure it was capturing every word. As he heard their plan, his heart raced. For the first time, he fully grasped the scale of the danger James was facing. Richard and Sophia weren't just planning to kill James, they intended to trap him in multiple ways. Ethan waited until the study lights went out and the father and daughter left the room. Then, moving quickly and silently, he withdrew from the property. Ethan entered James's study, holding the small recorder tightly in his hand. James was seated at his desk reviewing some documents, but as soon as he caught sight of Ethan's serious expression, he immediately set the papers aside. "What did you find?" James asked, his gaze sharp. Ethan placed the recording device on the table and hit play. As Richard and Sophia's voices echoed through the quiet room, James froze. Every word, every sentence felt like another stab at his trust. "We need to bring this to an end soon. We can't just rely on the car accident anymore. I'll find a way to get close to him, to make him trust me again." James sat still, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Anger surged through him, but he quickly regained control. He knew he couldn't afford to act on emotion. "Now I'm certain," James said, his voice cold as ice. "They won't stop until I'm gone." Ethan stayed silent, waiting for James to continue. "I need more evidence," James said, turning his gaze to the boy. "What you found is enough to prove they're plotting, but I want more. I want something they can't deny." Ethan nodded. "I can keep going, but we'll need to be careful. They might start getting suspicious if I show up near their house again." James agreed. "You're right. We'll have to plan this carefully. And in the meantime, I'll prepare for my next move." The next morning, Sophia was in the kitchen making breakfast, something she rarely did. When James walked in, she looked up and gave him a sweet smile. "Good morning, darling," she said softly. "I thought I'd make breakfast for you today. You've been working so hard." James paused in the doorway, his eyes cautiously observing her. He knew her smile wasn't genuine, but he didn't let his suspicion show. "Thank you," James said, sitting down at the table. "That's very thoughtful of you." Sophia smiled, placing a plate of food in front of him. "I want to make up for not paying enough attention to you. I think we should spend more time together." James took a sip of his coffee, the bitterness matching the situation he found himself in. "You're right," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "We should." On the surface, James appeared calm, but inside he knew Sophia was trying to deceive him. And now, thanks to Ethan, he was ready to counter every move she made. As the truth gradually comes to light, James is moving closer to exposing the conspiracy. But will the evidence Ethan has gathered be enough to turn the tide? How many more secrets are waiting to be revealed? If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to follow James and Ethan's journey. James sat in his study, staring at the small recording device on his desk. Ethan's recording had confirmed his worst suspicions, but it also left him with a heavy feeling. It wasn't fear, it was the sense that everything he had built was crumbling around him. Sophia, the woman he had loved, the one he thought would share in his success, had now become his enemy. Ethan sat on the edge of the sofa, his eyes fixed on James. "What are you going to do next?" he asked. James took a deep breath, his gaze steely as he replied, "I'm going to make them think their plan is progressing perfectly. If they believe I'm still clueless, they'll keep making mistakes. And that's when I'll have the chance to take them down." "You mean pretend like you don't know anything?" Ethan frowned, uncertain. "Exactly," James said firmly. "They're preparing their next move. We're going to stay one step ahead. But first, I need her to believe I'm still completely in the dark." Ethan nodded, though unease lingered in his chest. He understood this wasn't a simple game. Even the smallest mistake could cost James his life. Sophia stood in front of the mirror in the master bedroom, carefully selecting a necklace to pair with her elegant dress. She wanted everything to be perfect today. She planned to invite James to lunch at an upscale restaurant. She needed to smooth over his trust and test whether he suspected anything. When she came downstairs, she saw James standing in the kitchen, making coffee. "James," she called softly, her voice gentle, "I have an idea. Why don't we go out for lunch today? Just the two of us, like we used to when we were newlyweds." James turned around and looked at her with a fleeting smile. "That's a wonderful idea, Sophia. It's been a long time since we've spent any real time together." Sophia smiled faintly, pleased that he didn't seem suspicious. A few hours later, they were seated at a private corner table in Le Grand, a restaurant bathed in the soft glow of candlelight. Sophia had chosen the place carefully private enough to avoid interruptions, yet luxurious enough that James wouldn't suspect anything unusual. "I know I've been a bit distant lately," Sophia began, her voice carrying a hint of feigned tenderness. "But it's not because I don't care about you. I've just been feeling the pressure from everything around us." James took a sip of his wine, watching her over the rim of his glass. "I understand. Life can be pretty overwhelming sometimes." Sophia smiled softly. "We shouldn't let that affect our marriage, should we? I think we need a fresh start. Maybe a trip, just the two of us." James nodded, hiding the contempt rising within him. He knew full well her words were just a cover for her scheme. "Sounds good," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "We can plan for it later." Throughout the meal, Sophia continued trying to appear warm and attentive, but James didn't miss a single detail. The way she watched him, her eyes always sharp, as if studying his reaction to every word, told him all he needed to know. That evening, after Sophia left to attend a charity event, James made a call to his lawyer, Mark Reynolds. "Mark," James said urgently, "I need you to come over tonight. We need to set everything into motion." An hour later, Mark arrived at James's mansion, carrying a briefcase full of documents. James sat across from him, his gaze cold and unwavering. "I want you to arrange for all my assets and control of the company to be transferred into a trust," James said. "This trust will be completely untouchable by Sophia or her family under any circumstances, even if I die." Mark raised an eyebrow but nodded. "All right, I'll start drafting the paperwork immediately." "But James, do you really think Sophia and her family would do something like this?" James was silent for a moment, his eyes filled with pain. "I don't just think, Mark. I know, and I'm not going to let them succeed." Meanwhile, Ethan continued his mission. He had spent the entire day trailing Sophia and Richard. At a small cafe in Manhattan, he spotted the two meeting in secret. Ethan sat at an outside table, using his phone to discreetly record a video of their conversation. "You're sure he doesn't suspect anything?" Richard asked, his voice tinged with worry. "Absolutely," Sophia replied, her face betraying no emotion. "He's completely buying my act. But we need to move to the next step soon. I can't keep up this facade forever." Ethan crouched lower, adrenaline coursing through his veins. This video would be another valuable piece of evidence. When Sophia and Richard left, Ethan quickly made his way out of the cafe and returned to James's mansion. Bursting into James's study, Ethan was out of breath. "You're not going to believe this. I got video footage of them meeting. They're discussing the next step in their plan." James took the phone from Ethan's hand and watched the video. As he saw Richard and Sophia talking, any lingering doubts vanished. Every piece of the betrayal puzzle was now clear. "You did well," Ethan, James said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Thanks to you, we have everything we need to act." Ethan looked at James, his eyes full of determination. "So, what's the next step?" James sat down in his chair, his eyes flashing with icy resolve. "We'll let them think they've won. But in reality, that's when they'll lose." James stood before the large window in his study, his gaze fixed on the garden behind the mansion. The winter wind swept through the trees, making their branches tremble under the dim glow of the outdoor lights. In James's mind, every step of his counterattack plan was mapped out with precision. From now on, every move he made would draw Sophia and Richard closer to the trap he had meticulously prepared. Ethan sat on the nearby sofa, his eyes filled with curiosity and a touch of worry. "Are you sure they'll take the bait?" he asked. James turned to him, his expression resolute. "They believe I don't suspect a thing, and that is our greatest advantage. I'll make them think they're in control." He walked to his desk and pulled out a folder. "This is the next step," James said, handing the folder to Ethan. "What is this?" Ethan asked, flipping through the documents inside. "Fake evidence," James replied, his voice cold. "These documents will make Sophia and Richard believe I'm preparing to transfer all my assets into a joint account with Sophia. This will lull them into a false sense of security and push them to accelerate their plans." Ethan looked at James with a hint of confusion. "But how can you be sure they'll fall for it?" James smirked, a sharp, calculating smile. "Sophia is trying to convince me she's still the loving wife she pretends to be. She won't be able to resist an opportunity to gain full control of my assets. We'll make sure these documents fall into her hands. She'll think she's won." The next day, James intentionally left the folder on his desk in plain sight, where Sophia would easily notice it. When she walked in to speak with him, her eyes quickly darted to the folder. James, what's this? Sophia asked, feigning casual curiosity as she gestured toward the folder. James looked up from his computer, smiling as if it were nothing of importance. Oh, that? It's some paperwork related to merging our assets. I thought it was about time we officially consolidate everything. We are husband and wife after all, aren't we? Sophia froze for a moment, but she quickly masked her surprise with a smile. Oh, that's wonderful, James. I've always thought we should have done that a long time ago. James looked at her, carefully hiding the contempt in his eyes. I'll finalize all the paperwork next week. I just want to make sure everything is in order before signing. Sophia smiled softly, but there was a glimmer of ambition in her eyes. I'm so glad you've thought of this. I really feel like we're growing closer than ever. James nodded, knowing deep down that she had taken the bait. That evening, Sophia met Richard at his house, carrying the folder James had deliberately left on the desk. She handed it to her father, her voice brimming with excitement. You won't believe this, she said. James is actually transferring all his assets into our joint account. This is the perfect opportunity to finish everything. Richard took the folder and flipped through the pages. His eyes gleamed as he read the documents. He's more naive than I thought, he said with disdain. But this means we can't delay any longer. I'll set the final step in motion. What do you mean? Sophia asked. Richard looked at her, his gaze cold and calculating. We're not waiting for the transfer to happen. We have to act now before he changes his mind. You need to make sure he leaves the house tomorrow. I'll handle the rest. Sophia nodded, a mix of exhilaration and nervousness stirring inside her. The final step of their plan was approaching, and she knew that if it succeeded, everything would belong to her. Meanwhile, Ethan continued to track Sophia and Richard's every move. He discreetly planted a listening device in Richard's study, where he believed they would finalize their plans. When Richard made a phone call to an unidentified man, his voice came through clearly on the recording device. Everything needs to be ready, Richard said. Tomorrow, when he leaves the house, make sure the car never reaches its destination. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. He quickly collected the recording and rushed back to James's mansion to report. Ethan burst into James's study, urgency written all over his face. I overheard Richard's call, he said, breathless. They're planning to act tomorrow. They're talking about sabotaging your car again. James sat down, his eyes sharp as knives. Good. This is exactly what I've been waiting for. They're walking right into the trap. What are we going to do? Ethan asked, his worry evident. James stood, placing a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. We're going to follow their plan exactly. But this time, I'll be the one in control. The next morning, James pretended to be none the wiser. He got into the car and left the house, just as Sophia and Richard had anticipated. However, what they didn't know was that James had switched his car for another vehicle. The original car had been thoroughly inspected and was now under strict surveillance by a private security team James had hired. Ethan, tasked with monitoring the situation from a distance, stood ready with recording equipment. He observed Richard and the man he had hired to sabotage the car. When the decoy car James was driving stopped at a secluded location, James's security team sprang into action, surrounding Richard and his accomplice. The entire operation had been recorded from Richard giving the order to sabotage the car to his direct confirmation that James needed to disappear for good. Richard was handcuffed on the spot, his face pale as he realized he had been outsmarted. That afternoon, the weak sunlight streamed through the large curtains in the living room of James Carter's mansion. The air was suffocatingly quiet, but inside emotions were boiling over. James sat in a large leather armchair, his hands clasped in front of him. His gaze was fixed forward as Sophia walked into the room, her face calm, as if everything was still under her control. James, you're here? I thought you had a meeting, Sophia said, her tone carefully natural. James didn't reply right away. He stood slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. Sophia, we need to talk. Right now. Sophia hesitated for a moment but quickly put on a soft smile. Of course, darling. What's the matter? You look so serious. James gestured to the sofa across from him. Sit down. Sophia sat, placing her hands on her lap, maintaining a relaxed posture, though her eyes began scanning him cautiously. What is it, James? You're making me nervous. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a USB drive. placing it on the table between them. His gaze was cold, his voice devoid of any warmth. I want you to watch something. Sophia let out a light laugh, trying to appear unfazed. Oh? What is this? Did you find some funny video or something? James didn't answer. He retrieved a laptop from his desk, plugged in the USB, and played the video. The screen lit up with footage of Richard and Sophia sitting in a cafe, discussing how to speed things up and their plan to make sure James disappears forever. Sophia's face turned pale, the smile vanishing from her lips in an instant. James, what is this? Did you spy on me? James leaned forward, his piercing eyes boring into hers. No, Sophia, this is what I had to do to survive, and now I know, without a shadow of a doubt, that you and your father have been plotting to kill me. Sophia jumped to her feet, desperately trying to regain her composure. This is a misunderstanding. I don't know what you're talking about. Someone must have set this up to make you think I did something. James let out a cold, emotionless laugh. Really? A misunderstanding. Then let me play this. He clicked on another file, and this time the audio recording from the listening device Ethan had planted in Richard's study played loud and clear. Richard's voice was unmistakable. We need to make sure he doesn't survive. The car is ready. Once he leaves the house, it'll all be over. Sophia sank back onto the sofa, her hands trembling. She couldn't find the words to respond. Any attempt at an excuse now was pointless. James looked at her, his voice colder than it had ever been. Sophia, I spent my entire life building everything, this company, my wealth, and our marriage. I trusted you. I loved you. And all I got in return was betrayal. Sophia burst into tears, her eyes brimming with desperation. But James was unmoved. Don't pretend anymore, he said, his voice like steel. It's over, Sophia. And now you'll face the consequences of your actions. At the same time, in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of New York, James's security team and the police apprehended Richard and the accomplice he had hired to sabotage James's car. Richard, handcuffed, yelled in desperation, "You can't do this. I have lawyers. I'll sue all of you." The police commander stepped forward, holding up the video evidence and other materials collected by James's team. "Richard Prescott, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and property sabotage. We have all the evidence we need to convict you." Richard had no defense. He knew every escape route had been cut off. Sophia sat on the bed in the master bedroom, her eyes swollen from crying. James stood at the door, looking at her one last time. "I've moved all my assets out of your and your father's reach. From now on, neither my company nor my wealth will have anything to do with you." Sophia looked at him, her expression filled with despair. "James, please, you can't do this. I have nothing without you." James shook his head, his voice low but resolute. "That's the price of betrayal, Sophia. You destroyed everything with your own hands." He turned and walked out of the room, shutting the door behind him. A few weeks later, life began to settle back into place. Richard and his accomplice had been imprisoned and were awaiting trial. Sophia, having lost everything, left the mansion and disappeared from James's life. James stood on the balcony of the mansion, gazing out at the quiet garden below. Ethan stepped outside, carrying 2 mugs of hot tea. "Are you okay?" he asked, setting one mug down on the table. James gave a faint smile, the first time in weeks that he felt a sense of relief. "I'm okay, Ethan, thanks to you." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck shyly. "I just did what I thought was right." James looked at the boy, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You did more than that, Ethan. You didn't just save my life, you helped me realize that family isn't about blood. It's about loyalty and care." James stood up, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "From now on, you're part of my family, and I'll make sure you have a better life than anything you've ever dreamed of." Ethan looked up at James, his eyes bright. "Thank you, James. I'll never forget this." James smiled, his gaze turning toward the horizon. His life had changed forever, but out of the pain he had found renewal. And this time he knew he wasn't alone. The story of James and Ethan is not just one of overcoming betrayal, greed, and dark conspiracies. It's a testament to the power of honesty, loyalty, and hope. From the depths of pain, James found a true family in the most unexpected place, and from the shadows of betrayal, Ethan discovered the light of a new future. If this story moved you, leave a like to let us know you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more emotional and meaningful stories. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What detail in the story impacted you the most?